And now for the final chapter of Girlcott by Florenz Webbe Maxwell. Holding a proper conversation was impossible, so we rode in silence and I was able to concentrate on getting to the boycott. I could feel myself being a part of the crowd for freedom. This was indeed the icing on my birthday celebration. Nothing could possibly mar the elation I was experiencing as I inhaled the fresh air that caressed my face. I would have enjoyed taking the scenic route along Cedar Avenue past the picturesque Victoria Park, but George suggested we take Wesley Street instead. This brings us right out near the boycott, he said, and I agreed, for I too was anxious to reach our destination without any further hindrance. If I had not changed to my pedal pushers, we would have arrived sooner. Voices rose like a symphony as we drew closer to the boycotters, and I could feel every organ in my body thrill to the sound. This was a happy beginning to my birthday celebration. I could tell that George was also feeling the excitement, for he was about to touch my hand around his waist when the bike swerved. I landed in a clump of cane grass with my mobilette on top of me. At first, I thought we had lost balance until I saw George on the ground a few feet ahead with his knee on the stomach of a boy. They were wrestling. George at one time on top of his opponent, and then in an instant he was under. I tried to struggle from under my bike, but it was too heavy and there was no way I could help George. I watched helplessly, and I was relieved when George managed to flip the boy over and pin his arms to his sides, preventing punches from landing on his face. Suddenly, a hand grabbed the handle and stood the mobilette upright. "This is our lucky night," said a familiar voice. I gasped. It was Almira Wallace. While I was struggling to my feet, she said with her familiar snarl, "This is our turn to get even. Me and Nigel have had enough of you colored folks stopping us from going to the movies. This is payback time." Before I could figure out what was going on, she started to move away with my mobilette. "Get your hands off my bike!" I gave her a hard push, and while she did let go of the handle, she did not lose her balance and plunged back at me. "It's not yours anymore. You can have that one over there." A rusty mobilette was on a stand near to where George had Nigel pinned beneath him. I saw with relief that George was in control and turned my attention back to Almira. "You put your hands back on my bike and—" I didn't finish my sentence, for she stepped away from me, dropping her hands to her sides. Her mouth grew wide enough to swallow her entire face. "What is going on here?" I swung around to see a tall, heavily built white man move towards the two boys who were still on the ground. I gaped, for I did not see where he had appeared from. Almira was still frozen in position. I was trembling, for I could hear shouting coming from the crowd at the boycott. We were close. I feared any commotion coming from us would attract attention. With one motion, the man snatched George by the collar and yanked him to his feet. Nigel immediately scrambled to his feet. The man was wearing dungarees and a plain white shirt, but I could tell by his confident stride that he was a plainclothes policeman, most likely on his way to the boycott to arrest any troublemaker who dared to step out of line. "I'm a police officer," he said in a crisp British accent, confirming my suspicion. He had a tight grip on George and shook him. "I want to know the meaning of this." "Sir, he wanted to steal my bike," Nigel answered, facing the policeman and grinning. "My girlfriend and I were trying to go to the movies when he jumped us and threw me to the ground." He pointed at George. His lie sounded so convincing I became suddenly mute. But George looked the policeman directly in his eyes. They were almost the same height. His voice calm and controlled. "That's not true, sir. He was the one who attacked us. That mobilette he's talking about is my girlfriend's birthday present." The officer then turned his attention to Nigel, and it was obvious that he believed his story and not George's. I was now resentful at the way George was being held as if he was the crook and not Nigel. I walked over to the policeman and said in a voice that I later regretted but could not control, "That's not fair. Why would you believe his story?" "Be careful, girl," the officer said, turning a fierce look at me and still holding on to George. "I can have you both arrested." "Do that," piped up Almira, who had her hand on the handle of my mobilette. "My mother had to fire her when she worked for us." She wagged a finger at my direction. Her sneering tone reminded me of that horrible afternoon at the Wallaces. I wanted to push her into the bushes and stamp on her, but my feet were glued to the road. The noise from the picketers in the background drew my attention. They were only a few yards away from us, and all we needed was for any one of them to see this policeman with us and the two mobilettes. The expression on my face alone could rouse their curiosity, and I shuddered to think of the reaction that could follow. Desma, show your license, George said, breaking through my fear. The policeman had a grip on his wrists like handcuffs. That will prove whose bike it really is. The triumphant look disappeared from his face when he noticed my pedal pushers, without pockets, and realized that I had forgotten to bring the valuable evidence. With the sounds of the boycotters and now this disaster, I held my head down to prevent anyone seeing the tears that were filling my eyes. Don't you dare lose control, a familiar voice said in my head said. I threw my shoulders back and glared at Nigel. You know jolly well that's not your bike. I pointed to my mobilette and then turned in the direction of his. That bony shaker over there is what you owe. I could feel my blood bubbling away as I turned in the direction of the policeman. Ask him to show his license. Then you'll see whose bike it really is. You don't need to show a license, right, Nigel? Laughed Elmira. She was enjoying the predicament. My girlfriend's right. White people don't have to prove they own something. That's for coloreds. Common sense can tell who that bike belongs to, right, officer? The policeman didn't answer at once. He released George, reached in his pocket, pulled out a small notepad and pencil. I want all of your names and addresses, he said, his eyes resting on each one of us, all four of you. I will then contact your parents and find out who exactly owns the blue mobilette. That's not necessary, officer, said Nigel. I told you what happened. It's my bike, and I don't need to prove it by carrying around a license. I keep telling you that colors need to prove they're not pulling a fast one. Nigel, let it go. Let's go, said Elmira, tugging at his shirt. I don't want my parents dragged into this. Let her keep her old rusty bike. Okay, said Nigel as he skipped over to his mobilette and kicked it off the stand. Sorry, officer, for your trouble, he muttered, avoiding the policeman's angry expression. As if in protest, the motor splurted into action and Elmira jumped onto the passenger seat. It was worth £1,000,000 to see the two of them scamper away in the gathering dusk, the mobilette rattling more than it roared. The policeman walked over to me and put a hand on my shoulder. My apologies to you, and he turned to George, and to you. You can press charges. That's not necessary, I said, listening to the cheers and shouts from the boycotters nearby. I'm just glad this didn't happen closer to the theater. The policeman shook our hands before we left to walk the rest of the way on Wesley Street. He had reassured me that my mobilette could remain near the bushes since he was patrolling the area, and he promised to keep an eye on it. What a close call, George said. I agreed as we approached the Island Theater. My eyes swept over to the little theater a few yards away and back to the crowd that connected the two buildings. I remember before I took the Oxbridge exam, I went to the Island Theater to see what my parents considered were appropriate movies. These events were so special that I never noticed I was always ushered downstairs to the colored section. And since nobody made a fuss and there were no signs saying for colored only, the whole business of segregation went over my head. When Papa suggested treating my class to the movies, I was so filled with ecstasy, nothing was going to ruin such a precious gift. Now I felt relieved that I did not fall into the trap of paying to be treated like I wasn't a real person. The foyer of the large theater was empty now. No lines of impatient people formed a snake to get inside. The ticket box near the front looked desolate and lonely. This boycott is amazing, George said, looking around at the crowd, many walking up and down and brandishing their placards. I expected people to be angry and at least see police with dogs and guns. The police are here, I said, remembering the encounter we had just left. Bermuda police aren't armed and they don't have dogs trained for a boycott. I know that, but look at this crowd. Nobody's unruly. Everybody's taking the boycott seriously, though. That progressive group is some kind of powerful. People seem to be concentrating on the message, not the messenger, I said, choosing my words carefully and rooting inwardly for Mrs. Burroughs and the progressive group. A man near me raised his placard like exclamation marks. Down with the segregation, up with the theater boycott. A shiver tickled my entire body, and I too began shouting, down with segregation, up with the theater Girlcott. George grabbed my hand and held it high and chanted, segregation, you'll drop dead when Girlcott comes with X, Y, Z. The man began applauding and the excitement became contagious as others joined in. It was obvious that they caught our enthusiastic spirit instead of what we were shouting. I'm glad I didn't miss this, George said as he hugged me. Thanks for the invitation. This was the closest we had been, and although I enjoyed the way I felt in his arms, I did not want to move too quickly, especially when Papa trusted me. I wanted to get to know him better. Eileen kept me informed about Benny's many girlfriends, and I always felt sorry for them when he changed them faster than he did his shirts. So I pulled away but squeezed his hand. George gave me that winning lopsided smile, and I knew he understood. There was shouting behind us, and I saw a white sailor standing at the makeshift public address system, waving his hands like a windmill. He had an American accent, and in his excitement spoke quickly. Although I couldn't understand what he was saying, I joined in with the crowd who was applauding and cheering him on. Let's find the others, I told George as we moved in the direction of the little theater a short distance away. I'm sure they must be wondering where we are by now. It took us a while to find my guests, for they were scattered all over the place. Dedrick and Hugh came into view first, Dedrick carrying my placard, meandering in and out of the sea of people. I was surprised to see Frank with them, and he seemed to be enjoying their company. We've all been looking all over for you, Hugh said, eyeing us from head to toe. Dedrick told your father that you were walking around talking to people. You owe me, Dedrick smirked, holding the placard higher. Everybody's near the little theater, Frank said, shaking his head at the two clowns. So far, nobody's asked for you. George took my hand and we walked away from the clowns and Frank. After a while, I spotted my father, some of my class members, and Aunt Desma standing not far from the theater, as Frank had predicted. To my surprise, Jolie and Julie were holding on to Aunt Desma, standing quietly on either side, their eyes popping with excitement. We're going to get more cake if we're good, said Jolie, looking up at Aunt Desma, who smiled down at her. And we're good. This came from Julie, not to be outdone. We're doing history, they said in chorus with wide grins on their faces. My attention was turned to two men who were obviously in charge of the crowd. One took over the loudspeaker while the other egged him on. Colored people pay £3,500 a week in cinema admission. Over a period of 6 months, we could build a new theater of our own with that money, he shouted. The crowd cheered and clapped. I looked over at Papa and remembered how I almost added my post office savings to that amount. Papa was clapping and nodding in agreement. I wished Mama had come, but she was still not convinced that the boycott was a safe idea. The speaker continued, we don't know who the progressive group is, but they've sure made progress in organizing this boycott. Many of you are wondering why the leaders of the movement have not come forward. They're behind the scenes giving us guidance. I can tell you that there is a lot of brain behind this. I can also tell you I am just a small cog in this big wheel. Hear, hear, I said, glad that no one knew the secret of the progressive group. Hear, hear, the twins said in chorus, and people around us laughed. The speaker went on, his voice husky with excitement. Tonight, Negroes all over the world are wishing us the best of luck in our protest. More air-splitting cheers went up. Someone in the crowd shouted, kill the buggers, kill them all. Another voice yelled, save one for me. The speaker's voice boomed, no violence, please. The progressive group said we must protest with no violence. We don't want to let them or ourselves down. Let them see we can be trusted. I thought of the confrontation with Almira and Nigel and shuddered when I recalled how close we had come to shattering that trust. Eileen and Preacher Timothy appeared just at that moment, followed by Frank and the clowns. I noticed that Dedrick was still waving the placard. Here they are, said Hugh when he spotted us, and beside him was a man with a camera around his neck and a notebook tucked under his arm. This young man here, said the man with the camera, addressing me and pointing to Frank, told me that you are 16 today, and instead of having an ordinary birthday party, you decided on a block party and brought your guests here to support the boycott. True? Hugh interrupted. He's a reporter, Desma. I told him that our whole class was supposed to go to the theater today to see Yul Brynner and the Buccaneer, but the boycott changed the plans. It's more fun here. Dedrick joined in, waving the placard. He saw the slogan and wanted to know who made it up, and I told him. The reporter stepped in front of Dedrick and looked directly at me. This is a good news story, and you are an inspiration to the number of young people who are here tonight. Tell me exactly how you came up with such an idea. Eileen came next to me and squeezed my hand. She knew by the expression on my face that I was feeling nervous about expressing myself. Think about your equation, she said between her teeth, so that no one would notice she was talking to me. Think about X as knowledge, Y is in integrity, and Z is action. I returned the squeeze, took a deep breath, and looked directly at the reporter. The idea about a block party came to me after I found out about segregation. I had no knowledge that colored people were punished if they spoke out against it. Today, I was supposed to take my class to the movies to celebrate my birthday, but thanks to the boycott, I didn't go and pay to be segregated. I decided to celebrate with a block party instead and bring my guests to the theater boycott. In this way, we can take action and work with the progressive group to break down segregation. As my mama would say, united we stand, divided we fall. Some people who were standing nearby clapped when I finished. One woman with a flowered scarf on her head asked about the placard Dedrick was waving around. Eileen bragged that I was a genius in maths and that I expressed myself well in equations, better than I do in English. She prattled on that I even believe that Girlcott is a feminine of boycott because girls should have the same opportunities as boys. She ended by saying she calls this a Girlcott boycott. Several people laughed and many thought the idea was a good one. The reporter asked me to hold the placard while he snapped several pictures. Put me in the picture too, suggested Hugh standing beside me. Why not take all of my guests who are here, I asked, wanting a memento of this special day. It turned out that not only my guests were in the picture, but some of the people who were standing around listening to my story. The celebration did not end when I left the boycott scene 2 hours later, for George, Frank, Hugh, Dedrick, Desma, Eileen, Benny, and his current girlfriend, Mrs. Charter, Timothy, Reverend, and Mrs. Matters all came back to the house, where we sat in the dining room while I opened my many gifts. There were boxes of stockings, handkerchiefs, purses, a math book of puzzles from Mrs. Burrows, 116 pounds from Dr. Crown and his wife with a note from me to put the money in my piggy bank, and 16 pounds from Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Joe in Barbados, who could not come because they had 5 children and it would have been too expensive to bring everybody. This has been my best birthday ever, I said, when most of my guests had gone. I was now alone with my parents, Aunt Desma and Eileen, and we were sitting around the kitchen table, and Aunt Desma was telling us how she missed Bermuda, and after going to the boycott, she felt proud of my getting involved. As I listened to Aunt Desma singing my praises and the rest joining in, I couldn't help thinking about last week when Mr. Lewis told the whole school that I had made Bermuda proud. My mind also flashed to Mrs. Burrows, who had not only opened my eyes to the wonders of maths, but had inspired me to do my part with the boycott. I wanted to be like her and inspire other people my age to do all we can to make Bermuda proud. I had my misgivings about the progressive group, Mama said, breaking through my thoughts. I was worried about the crowd, rioting and all that. Thank God there was no violence, nobody getting killed, no dogs, no guns. This came from Papa, and we all looked at Mama and laughed. I admit I was worried about nothing. She wrinkled up her nose to suppress a smile. But who would have thought the progressive group would get so much support? I'm glad the boycott is working, I said. As Mama would say, when spiders' webs unite, they can tie up a lion. Everyone laughed, and Mama came round to my chair and hugged me so hard I wanted to burst with happiness. The end.